Well, we started today on a 2-week trek with Immanuel Kant. And I'd like today to be purely introductory. And then next time we'll be getting into the material from the Critique of Pure Reason, which will probably occupy us for 4 days. Then we'll have a day on the critique of practical reason, about ethics, and a day on his religious views, something of that sort. So to introduce him, I think to see his project, his philosophical project, in relationship to that of his predecessors, probably be as helpful as anything. The Critique of Pure Reason, which is his best known, longest, most difficult work, came out in 1781. And like David Hume, he felt that he needed to provide, in addition, a more popular view of the same sort of thing. And so some 10, 15 years later, he put out the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Now, get a handle on this title. First of all, Prolegomena. Now, if you've heard the story about elephants, you can anticipate something. The story is about people from different backgrounds who wrote books on elephants. The Englishman wrote a 1-volume hardback introduction to the elephant, very decorous. The American, an Elephant Digest. The Frenchman, an illustrated book on the elephant's love life. And the German, a 3-volume Prolegomena to the study of the elephant. Well, this is his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Now, get the point, more significantly, of the metaphysics. Because, in effect, David Hume became skeptical of any metaphysical knowledge, any knowledge of the nature of reality. All we know is appearances, phenomena. And beyond that, it's a matter of, at best, belief. So it's in the light of Hume's metaphysical skepticism that Kant defines his project as Prolegomena to any future metaphysic. That is to say, in the light of Kant, what are the prospects for metaphysics? You see. Now, he's explicit about that orientation in the introduction to the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. So that I'll read some of this. Since the essays of Locke and Leibniz, you remember Locke's essay on human understanding and Leibniz's new essays on human understanding? Since their essays, or rather since the origin of metaphysics, so far as we know its history, pushing it further back, nothing has ever happened that could have been more decisive to its fate than the attack made on it by David Hume. He threw no light on this species of knowledge, but he certainly struck a spark by which the light might have been kindled had it caught some inflammable substance and had its smouldering fire been carefully nursed and developed. Hume started from a single but important concept in metaphysics, namely that of the connection between cause and effect, including its derivatives like force. He challenged reason, which pretends to have given birth to the concept of cause and effect itself, to answer him by what right she thinks anything could be constituted that if that thing be posited, something else must necessarily posit it, in the light of cause and effect. Now that's not a bad summation of what Hume did. And he goes on the next page, however hasty and mistaken Hume's inference may appear, it was at least founded on investigation. But Hume suffered the usual misfortune of metaphysicians. And take note of this if you're thinking of going into metaphysics, of not being understood. It's positively painful to see how utterly his opponents, Thomas Reid, Oswald, Beattie, two other Scottish realists, missed the point. For while they were ever taking for granted what Hume doubted, and demonstrating with zeal, often with impudence, what he never thought of doubting, they so misconstrued his valuable suggestion that everything remained in its old condition as if nothing had happened. The question was not whether the concept of cause was right or useful or indispensable. Of course, Hume thought it was. But whether that concept could be thought by reason a priori, independently of experience. Whether it possessed an inner truth independent of experience. That was Hume's problem. Solely a question concerning the origin, not the need for the concept. Well, he goes on to point out that the Scottish realists' appeal to common sense really is not sufficient. He says it is indeed a great gift of God to possess plain common sense. But this common sense must be shown in action by well-considered, reasonable thoughts, not by appealing to it as an oracle when no other rational justification of one's position can be advanced. And so he comes to his project in the light of this. I therefore first asked whether Hume's objection could not be put into a general form, and soon found that the concept of cause and effect was by no means the only concept by which the understanding thinks of things a priori, but rather that metaphysics consists altogether of a priori concepts. I sought to ascertain their number, and you'll find he thinks there are 12. But when I had satisfactorily succeeded in this by starting from a single principle, I proceeded to deduce these concepts, which I was now certain were not derived from experience. I proceeded to deduce them as Hume had attempted to derive them, but found they sprang from the pure understanding. So, in effect, he's going to try and respond to Hume by saying that the concept of cause and effect over which skepticism developed, along with other basic metaphysical concepts, are, after all, not empirically derived, but are in some sense a priori. Okay? And later on, he goes on in this fashion. Metaphysics is properly concerned with synthetic a priori propositions. A priori propositions. And he concludes his preamble with this rhetorical flourish. Even Kant is capable of rhetorical flourish. All metaphysicians are therefore solemnly and legally suspended from their occupations until they shall have adequately answered the question, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? Okay? For the answer contains the only credentials that they must show when they've anything to offer in the name of pure reason. But if they do not possess these credentials, they can expect nothing else of reasonable people who have been deceived so often than to be dismissed from their occupation without further inquiry. So he's ready to fire all the metaphysicians who cannot show cause why they shouldn't stay. Well, his project then is pretty crucial. He recognizes that in the light of Hume's skepticism, the very possibility of doing metaphysics is in serious question. So if there's going to be any possible metaphysics in the future, any future metaphysic, then it's necessary by way of prolegomena to establish that such metaphysical concepts are a priori. Okay? Now, that's what he's trying to do. And I think we can come at it by trying to look at his own terminology. And this is terminology which he develops in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason. And that material you have in the anthology from 367 to about 377. I'm not suggesting that that introduction is nothing but terminology, but I think the terminology that he introduces provides an entree into the much larger picture. So let's look at that. He makes a distinction towards the outset, three philosophy: dogmatic, skeptical, and critical philosophy. Now, you have no difficulty identifying who or what he has in mind by skeptical. David Hume. Yes. The dogmatic philosophy, however, is the earlier metaphysicians. Those who've made dogmatic metaphysical assertions without examining the basis. So he has in mind there certainly that continental rationalist tradition. You recall our diagram where you have the continental rationalism of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, each of them developing their own metaphysical system using the methodology of Descartes, trying to say that there are certain axiomatic first principles from which everything else can be deduced. Now, that is dogmatic metaphysics. Okay? On the other hand, we have, at an earlier stage, people like Locke, who also seems to think that metaphysical knowledge is possible, though on an empirical basis, and Berkeley, of course, and their metaphysical conclusions would also qualify as dogmatic. So it's David Hume, the skeptic, and the dogmatic philosophers. We should say that while Leibniz was around